I am so happy and excited to have Stanford Carpenter, Lisa Sheperd, and Ricardo Padilla with me today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to talk about struggles, resistance, affirmation, Black and brown comics, and anything in between. I know this is extremely close to you all and your heart and all of the things that you do. I know, Lisa, you are an artist. You also kind of from the ground up with SOLCON and other expos, kind of bringing these spaces together. Stanford, the same. I know you curate exhibits, you have your podcast, you do also so much for the city of Chicago with Brown and Black comics. And of course, Ricardo Padilla with your Latino Comics Expo and your own comics. You guys bring so much experience, skill, expertise, sensitivity to this space. So I wanted to launch us with the question of the big question, you know, people talk and have been talking forever about like the Superman signal or the bat signal and all of that. But now we have our own symbols out there. And I really wanted to talk to you guys about this and the power of the symbol, especially symbols that we've created, that we own, that we project as possibly a kind of resistance space. Maybe, Ricardo, we can start with you and then move to Lisa and Stanford.
The interesting thing, I guess, for me and like the Latino Comics Expo is, with everything that's been going on, it's hard not to feel, I don't know if vindicated is the best word, but I've just been so like proud and happy that for the last couple of years that we've had events like, you know, Black Comics Arts Festival, Latino Comics Expo, where we were able to create a space that I think maybe helped incubate a lot of these themes that are going on about, you know, self-representation, about doing stuff in our own community, in our own culture. I mean, I remember a lot of work that you've done just about reclaiming the narrative. And, you know, for our conventions, you know, where we deal with our own, you know, communities and stuff like that, you know, it wasn't long ago where people would be saying to us, it's like, you know, why are you separating? You know, why are you doing your own convention? Why are you going, you know, to the Black Comics Arts Festival? Why are you going to Latino Comics Expo? But now with everything that's going on, you kind of feel fortunate, like, you know what, I'm glad that we had these spaces. I'm glad we gave these opportunities for artists to speak out, to do their own thing, you know, to speak on our own experiences, to bear witness. And I'm really kind of like proud of the arts community, the comics community, because I think we've been at the forefront of a lot of, like you said, issues and symbols and stories that definitely need to be told so people can have a bigger context and experience what we've been going through as a people. I hope people heard me.
Lisa, how about you? I know that this is also a really important place for you and your art, kind of putting our art out there, but also kind of distilling it and creating these symbols where we can kind of, as communities of color, come around and create this movement of solidarity.
I've been feeling there's, ever since like the Black Panther movie and all these things going on, it's been extremely exciting and it makes me hopeful. But at the same time, with all the, you know, the racism, the riots, it feels like a punch in the stomach, like we're regressing and going backwards. But we never were. We're still in the same place. It's just more in the forefront. And I've like you said before, I'm glad these things have been in place. So we're not starting over. We're already here and already building and moving forward. So we don't have to start from the ground up and move up. We just have to keep on doing what we're doing and not let what's going on in the world take away from that. Because right now it's being elevated with Black Lives Matter and so many things. But I'm also fearful that when everything settles down, we might regress back to a certain state where everything's back to where it was before.
Stanford.
For me, I actually look at this moment with a sense of hope, and I wouldn't quite call it optimism. I'm not sure what the word is I would use, because I truly believe that I truly believe that we're in flux, and I do think that we have so much more now than we did 5 years, 10 years, 15 years ago. I mean, I think about my own journey. I mean, I loved comics as a kid. I learned to read comics to spite my mother because she wouldn't read them to me on demand. And but ultimately, I reached a point, this back in high school, where I was critical of the narratives, the stories that weren't there, right? You know, that inspired me to like think in terms of stories and where they come from. And that led me actually to become an archaeologist and then later a cultural anthropologist. And so I kind of look at the changes that we've experienced. I mean, there are so many more just options for Black superheroes than there were if you go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the aughts, right? There's so many more stories. And I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in our individual frustrations, as opposed to realizing that every time any person of color puts together a story and puts it out there and more than 5 people see it, that means that they're going to share it with 5 more people. So like we have images, we actually have just a lexicon of images out there, right? I'm thinking about you know, San Diego Comic-Con. I went to my 20th San Diego Comic-Con, and that was like the 3rd or 4th year for the Black Heroes Matters flash mob, right? When I first went to Comic-Con, it was hard to find Black people on the floor. Now we do a flash mob. And I look at what's happened with SOLCON and the Black and Brown Comic Arts Festival. I mean, those are real facts on the ground. And so even though things are not changing the way we'd like them to change in terms of the way we're being treated by society, we're being treated by the police, right? At least we can see it. At least now almost everyone's got a camera, which was not the case 10 years ago, right? At least now we have all these different ways to express our feelings, and we have images to express our feelings through. I mean, we can be I'm looking at what's happened in the past week with Juneteenth. Now all of a sudden, now it's not for the best reasons, but all of a sudden a whole bunch of organizations and corporations are like, oh, we have to recognize Juneteenth. I mean, a lot of people didn't know what Juneteenth was 10 years ago, right? So I just have a certain amount of faith that as time goes on, and if we're able to continue to just add little drops here and there, eventually the drops of water, you know, they become a pool, and then they become a stream, right? And then it becomes much more undeniable.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you guys have been sharing here is extraordinary, in that what we're seeing is not an S superhero, you know, or, you know, the Batman light up and kind of just created out of thin air, and then it begins to carry a certain cultural weight. But in fact, our communities coming together to create these symbols and the knowledge behind those symbols, right? Really extraordinary. You know, I picked a couple of examples here for us. Just, you know, the Kaepernick, that's Alberto Ledesma, the Tales from La Vida, that's I know Ricardo's in, and other things that we've all been participating in. They call me Morena. There you go. Thank you, Ricardo. you know, where I also see a very strong active move to, in and through art, show that we share common ground, to show that we support each other in our communities, our Latinx and our Black communities. I'd love to hear just kind of your honest sort of take on this and where we've been and where we're going.
I mean, I always tell people too, because I kind of share Stanford's kind of like optimism too, because I always tell people, you may not know it, but we are kind of in a golden age right now of Black, especially independent comics, Latinx independent comics, queer comics. There's so much variety, so much creativity going on right now that I'm pretty sure in 40, 50 years, people are going to look back on it and say, you know, during all this time, there was a golden age going on where so many artists, creators were doing groundbreaking work and really expanding comics, animation like never before. In fact, I tell people these last few years have always been reminding me kind of like the early days of hip hop. Like, you know, to find good hip hop back in the day, you couldn't go to Capitol Records or RCA. You kind of had to dig around and go to like independent record stores or taquerias or soulful places, buy your cassettes, buy your music. And I think it's the same kind of thing, is that I think the creativity, the artistry is there, and people just have to look for it. And like you said, one of the good things about the last trends about independent conventions is that something like, you know, SOLCON, we were able to get off the ground and get going. And I just kind of remember, you know, when it first started, we were kind of like, wow, can you believe that nothing like this has happened before? Where like an artistic movement of Black and brown people coming together, sharing practices, sharing experiences. We like, it's never happened before. Why hasn't that been? Why is that the case? Why has not more, you know, artistic partnerships, you know, been created between Black and brown people? But now looking back, it was like the perfect time and the perfect opportunity, you know, to make those connections and those partnerships. And that's why, like Stanford, I'm kind of optimistic about what could come from all this chaos.
Stanford, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, what I think is most interesting about this moment is that we're not just creating the images, we're also creating the context for understanding our images. And these are conversations that I've had with quite a few scholar creators, right? So, you know, so in my case, it's like I've done comics. I have a PhD in anthropology, right? I mean, Frederick, look at the scholarship that you're producing on comics by people of color, you know, Latinx comics, but also on Black comics, right? Look at like a John Jennings, who's churning out work, and like I was one of the people who worked with him on Box of Bones. I did some of the coloring for it. And what's interesting is, like, when you look at that project, it's got back matter. Same thing with Bitter Root by David Walker. It's got back matter by scholars, people who are trained, you know, with all of with a lot of the credentials that were not present, you know, 20, 30 years ago. So it's like, we're not just creating the image. We are instead of like creating an image and waiting for somebody else to interpret it, we are creating and interpreting images at the same time. And that's very significant, because what that means, it's even like this moment right here, right? Right, you know, we've got images, we're talking about images, but we're also taking control of their interpretation in the, you know, in these greater cultural frameworks within universities, museums, right? And I think that's something that I don't think we talk about enough, about what that means when you have an artist of color create something and a scholar of color working alongside them, providing the interpretive framework. So it's not about, so it really is a radical defining, it's like a moment of radical self-definition that you don't get when you create something and wait for somebody outside of your group to interpret it and try and tell you what it means. It's like, and even when you start looking at the way art and criticism work, oftentimes you have someone produce the art, the critic says, well, this is what you really meant. We've kind of, by working on both the scholarly and artistic track and the creative track at the same time, we're kind of circumventing that. We're making it much more difficult for somebody to tell us what this means for our people and what this means for us.
Yeah, that was beautifully articulated. Lisa.
Yes. I see. I don't want to be the negative one in the group, but I'm not negative. I'm just always apprehensive. I see the forward momentum, but I don't want to be right now. I don't want to become a fad. You know, the in thing now is Black and Latino people and, you know, Latinx, and we're in right now. And then, you know, a year from now, you know, people won't have the same enthusiasm, which means we have to continue our own personal drive. Can't lose our own momentum because society's latest whatever is in this week and out the next week. But we have to keep the drive going. And I don't think I'm being negative. I'm just being realistic about how the world works. Right now, I feel like this is the time. If you want to get something done, this is the big time because everybody's open up to the idea. And so if you want to hit the ground running, now is the time. And but you have to we have to keep pushing even harder now. Now's the time to push even harder.
Yeah, what I hear there is making sure that it's actually not just a moment, but a movement. And a movement requires us all working together to kind of, assert that, clear that space.
To keep us from slipping back down that mountain.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you, Lisa, for that realistic kind of reminder compass north for us. So there have been, of course, we all know we've got a history of, Black superhero characters, Black Panther being the sort of the one that's on everybody's mind because of the MCU. But of course, hand in hand with that is the politics, the revolutionary politics and movement of the Black Panther Party. Stanford, maybe you can launch us and tell us, I have Black Panther up here, but of course there's some significant others. You were already mentioned, a little bit a while ago, some of these superhero characters. Where are you with superheroes, mainstreamed creative superheroes, and what's going on today?
I love the superhero genre. I think it's a genre that that is, it's been around a lot, but it still has not been completely explored. I mean, I've had some debates about the superhero genre. What I think is interesting is that it is in many ways there are a lot of things about that are very uniquely American about the superhero genre. Like this assumption that if you give an individual power, that they will automatically do what's right for people. So there's this very I mean, literally the superhero is the person with great power who does not become corrupted by it. And I think that you come to the 80s and the 90s where you have all of this trying to sort of deconstruct the superhero. And I think the moment that we're in that's really interesting is now we're looking at we're really paying more attention to how to construct a superhero. I'm looking at all these Black and brown characters. I'm looking at what happens when you take superhero comics, which are essentially power fantasies, right? And you really start to think about how do you create a superhero for a little girl, which is different, and that's what I always thought was interesting about Captain Marvel and about Wonder Woman, was taking my daughter and being like, oh, this character really isn't being written for me. And that's a good thing because this little person next to me needs a character, right? Ironically, you have one of my favorites up there is Misty Knight. I actually think of Misty Knight as kind of the Forrest Gump of the Marvel universe. Like she's been there for everything, sort of in the background, really interesting character. And I think that this examination of what happens when you take the notion of a superhero and apply it to somebody who is not part of a group that's in power. Because that's the other thing that's unique about superheroes is like each superhero has a constituency, right? And now we're trying to figure out what does it mean when you have a superhero that is of the Black or brown communities? Because in that context, look at our relationship to the police, right? It's very different. The police, we don't necessarily see the police as being out here to save us. So what happens when being a hero is not about law and order, right? So I think we are really in an interesting moment, and we're seeing it in terms of the different characters that are coming out, because it's not just Black Panther, it's Luke Cage. I think one of the most interesting superheroes out there right now is Black Panther on the CW, because what you see an intergenerational, approach to the superhero, because Black Panther, he's the father. He's got two daughters, both of whom, one in her teens, one in their 20s, both of whom are superheroes, and you see that intergenerational tension within a Black family. So like when I watch that, I'm seeing a very interesting recitation on the generation gap and the Black family within the superhero genre. And I think that's where things are going to start to get interesting, because quite frankly, people of color have different concerns and different things that they would want a hero to address and be a part of. And I think that's the moment that we're in, and I'm hoping that we continue in that vein.
Lisa.
I'm thinking right now, for me as a Black female, there's a huge gap in where there will be a Black female lead to have their own movie or own show. It's going to be, it's rare. I just remember the first time I saw Eartha Kitt as Catwoman in the reruns of the old Batman. That was powerful to me, to see a Black, even though she was a villain, she was still a powerful character. And I think the gaps between when you actually have strong female superhero type leads, there's huge gaps in years before you see it, but they don't actually have a lead role, so to speak, in a lot of the comics. They're almost sometimes secondary characters to other people. So the gap for Black female is going to be a lot longer to get there than it is right now for Black male superhero characters. And I know it's a long time coming, but that's where my push is going to go, towards more dynamically strong Black females, and to address the issues we have that some people don't even recognize. And I addressed this with an officer just quite recently, that now when we leave out the house, our fears are different than everybody else. We're threatened by the bad guys, but we're also threatened by the people that are supposed to protect us. And then if you call the people that are supposed to protect you, the situation may change where someone might die, or you might be held at gunpoint because they don't believe you are the person who called. There's so many scenarios. So I told him the problem is we hesitate. There's something going on. I don't know if I should call, because it could escalate into something more. So when we get characters, I think those are some of the things we have to address. It's like, we're not safe from the bad guys or the so-called good guys. So I don't even know how we could play this out in the world.
Ricardo.
That's a fascinating topic. And, the Latino community shares a lot of the issues too with the African-American creators. But the fact is that we have even less to choose from, especially in terms of like major market, corporate comics, in terms of Latinx heroes at all. So that's why I say, like, for somebody like myself, I really am happy that it is a kind of a golden age, especially in Latinx comics and creators, because I see them expanding on a lot of themes that are kind of unique to Latinx creators. Like, there's a lot of comics right now about, especially like lucha libre culture, which is very important to us, the mask, the duality of our existence in this culture. Lucha libre is big. There's a lot of independent comics dealing with issues on the border, also incorporating the superhero element, but explaining kind of like what's going on by using like the border as a theme or as a metaphor for our existence here right now. And a lot of artists, you know, going back and using like Aztec, you know, imagery, you know, Mayan histories and folk tales and incorporating it into their, you know, superhero comics. That's been really fascinating, and especially for people that are not aware with, you know, Latino culture or Latino symbols and images. That's the thing that encourages me, that there's a lot of people using those themes and incorporated into comics, superhero, you know, themes and stuff like that. So it's a unique time, but like Lisa says, it can't be just a flavor of the month. And that's kind of why I'm happy when I look back and I see, you know, something like the Latino Comics Expo has been around since 2011. BCAF, you know, after us started, Queer Expo, you know, there's a lot of foundational work that's been done. So it's, I think, also an opportunity to get our themes and our narratives out there as well.
So what I'm hearing is, you know, we're not waiting, like you guys have said before, you know, our creators, our communities are making those superheroes happen. You know, it's interesting that Misty Knight, the Black Panther and the crew, which, you know, like with Stanford, I think is like remarkable. And in fact, I think Misty Knight's way more of a superhero than Black Panther. But of course, you know, this great comic gets canceled, right? Anyway, let's move back a little bit here. Stanford, you mentioned some of your kind of early history origin with race and comics. This, of course, is one of the most famous. Stanford, do you want to launch us just briefly talking about, you know, maybe a little more about this sort of the depth of the experience of race in mainstream comics?
Okay, well, I mean, if you look at mainstream comics, one thing that's kind of, you know, I mean, historically, you really don't see a push towards having Black superheroes in mainstream comics until the 70s. I mean, Black Panther gets created in the 60s and is kind of in the background, and then the Falcon comes into play. But as far as like really, you know, those two characters are kind of floating around on their own for a while, and then in the 70s is when you get the John Stewart Green Lantern, which is the Black Green Lantern. You get Black Lightning, right? So there seems to be, you know, you start with primarily, and you also get Luke Cage in the 70s, right? And with Luke Cage, you get you know, Misty Knight. Misty Knight is actually based on a character that had been around before they gave the character the name Misty Knight, which I always thought was interesting. That's something that came through in some interviews I did with her creators. But it really is about looking at the labor. So like you know, Black Panther gets created as part of a storyline in Fantastic Four, and then he comes over to America, hangs out with the Fantastic Four, hangs out with the Avengers for a while. But the image that you see up there on the screen is actually from a storyline in Green Lantern, Green Arrow. And what had happened is they'd actually put Green Lantern and Green Arrow in the same book, and they did this road trip across America. And this he's confronted by an older African American who's basically says to Green Lantern, you know, you've got this power ring, you could do all this amazing stuff. And you seem to be helping everybody but us, us being African Americans. And he makes reference to all these aliens that he's helping out. And he's like, well, where are you for us? And I always find that to be really interesting, because it really, that's where you see this notion of constituency born out. It's like Green Lantern is a hero, but he doesn't, you know, but he's being challenged on, you know, are we your constituents? Are we people that you fight for? And so the 70s is a very interesting moment because of these types of stories. You know, meanwhile, you have what's happening with Power Man. Power Man teams up with a character where it's a white guy who's got all these martial arts powers called Iron Fist. Teams up and it comes a book, Power Man and Iron Fist, where it's a buddy book with a black superhero and a white superhero. But what people don't talk enough about is that they had their offices, Heroes for Hire, in a building, and in the same building there was Nightwing Restorations, which was a detective agency owned by Misty Knight and Colleen Wing. Colleen Wing is one of her parents is Chinese and one of her parents is Japanese, and she's a martial artist, and she teams up with Misty Knight. What's interesting is Power Man and Iron Fist always get into trouble, and Misty Knight and Colleen Wing are kind of like their personal cavalry, right? And so you have that book coming out of the 70s, along with Black Lightning, and then the 80s you just start the number of Black characters start growing exponentially. And as you alluded to earlier, what's not happening is that you're not seeing the same type of growth amongst brown characters. So, for example, you have the White Tiger that gets created, who is Latinx, but you don't see him being the character that starts making that starts making other characters grow, right? You don't see a whole bunch of other characters growing out of him. So what is interesting is that the 80s become this moment, and then at the end of the 80s going into the 90s, you have the creation of Milestone Comics, which introduces a whole other set of characters of color, especially in the superhero genre. Sorry about that.
Lisa, was there a moment for you, Lisa? I know you've mentioned in my documentary and other places that things like Star Trek and Nichelle Nichols was really kind of significant for you. Was there a moment when you felt like the space of popular culture or comics did do something that mattered?
I don't know if they tried, but at those times you were so happy for a little bit, someone dropping breadcrumbs, you would take it because there was nothing else, and so even if it wasn't significant, it was everything. Just to have someone of color, you were even happy if the person was Asian or Latina, whatever. You were happy because they weren't just the common, they weren't just white characters. So you took what you can get, and then when something more significant came along, you were ecstatic. But I also remember hating during that time period that white savior kind of scenarios in different comics and TV shows where, you had Black characters, but it was always the white character that saved the day or stepped in and saved the people of color instead of them saving themselves, kind of thing. And I remember being irritated by that, the white savior thing, which I didn't know had a name until, a few years ago. But it was a show off the subject a little bit called The White Shadow. And that made me think of that, people wouldn't be anywhere if they didn't have the backing of someone of non-color. So I remember always being kind of like, why can't the Black or Latinx characters, anyone save the day themselves without having someone more powerful, more heroic do it?
Yeah, Ricardo.
She makes a good point. She got me thinking when she mentioned the Eartha Kitt, because some people forget that the original Joker was famous actor Cesar Romero from the golden age of Hollywood, and we were always real happy that was like the closest we got. We got a Latino actor playing Joker, Cesar Romero, so we were really happy about that. But yeah, especially for a Latino growing up, it was hard to look, for Latinx representation. And even though we still love comics, I mean, I think that's why, like somebody like myself, I kind of geared more toward like somebody like the Silver Surfer, who was, whatever, but still, kind of like melancholy, confused about his place in the world and society. And those kind of comics, meant a lot to me and my friends growing up in the barrio. But I think that's why, especially me, it was with the Expo, I love independent comics. I love new creators, and I love, promoting that kind of work, just because, especially for, us in the Latinx community, there hasn't been a lot of, especially like you said, superhero representation, or or even leads in comics But I remember one time we were discussing this with the legendary cartoonist Sergio Aragones, and we're like, man, aren't you mad that you can't do a superhero, or don't you ever want to do a superhero? And he was telling us, a whole bunch of young people, he was saying, you have to remember that, like, for example, he left Spain during the Spanish Civil War. A lot of other artists had to leave their countries, because of revolution or poverty. And so he always said, like, for me, my father was my superhero, or the uncle that helped us immigrate, was my superhero, that helped us leave this dictatorship, that was my superhero. So that always kind of rang true to me, is like, sometimes you don't need people, flying through the air to be a superhero, but just have, a real strong story of communities and struggle, of communities trying to make it better for their families and their society. Those are the kind of things that really speak to me. And like I said, that's what makes me excited about, new trends and Black and brown comics, for sure.
I want to move us just along here to, we mentioned earlier in the conversation how Juneteenth, up until recently, and for some people, maybe even very recently, there really wasn't an anchor, an understanding of the significance of this date. And comic book creators have really, at least from what I can tell, kind of galvanized, kind of moved around this moment. Is there something that you all wanted to add to this? Maybe Stanford, we can start with you.
Well, I mean, one thing I think is interesting about this moment is it's kind of like one of those, like it's for better and for worse, right? Like, we are in a moment where something so terrible happened that a lot of people who normally don't think, or quite frankly care about what happens to people of color, are like, oh, we got a problem here, right? And so what we've got is, just as like you've got these companies that probably had people, companies were bending over backwards to say, we support our Black employees, Black Lives Matter, right? And to kind of in that zeal, you had a lot of companies that jumped onto Juneteenth. And I think that what it means is, and I'm also hearing stories about a lot of creators who are being contacted, and they get that that this is almost like a flavor of the month thing, right? That this moment is not going to last forever. But, my hope is that a few people in this moment are able to at least plant a flag so that there's going to be something that lasts out of this. Because, sometimes we don't get our opportunities in ideal circumstances, but they're opportunities nevertheless. So I'm hoping that this is a moment where some characters of color can be established, where we can get more stories about people of color, and that enough of them will survive in our ongoing public memory, that they're going to inspire people, and they're going to literally, instead of just it being about us getting a piece of the pie, that it's going to expand the pie, even if it's just a little bit. That's still something to take away.
Lisa.
Well, I'm grateful so many things are now in the forefront, because I think sometimes people had the attitude, oh my God, they're still talking about that. They're still talking about slavery. They're still that was so long ago. But I think they're starting to realize there were so many things, like in Tulsa, were not so long ago. It's history. The world didn't stop and start at slavery and then end at Martin Luther King. There's a whole history of things that follow even to today. But the attitudes of like, why are they still talking about it? Well, now that this is happening and the death of George Floyd has put this all in the forefront. And I think now people are starting to see that this racism has continued nonstop with the same amount of force that it has been since slavery. And now that we have social media, now people can see things that they normally wouldn't see on the news or in a newspaper. Now we're aware that there's even more things going on that we never even knew about. And it should be frightening. It should make people wake up and say, hey, what's going on here? This is not something people are making up. This is not fake news. This is real things that are happening to real people every day. And if we're not exempt, that also means you're not either. And they're starting to find that out too, that there's no limit to where people want to be in power and have power, and they want to maintain that power, that everyone's expendable.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone, you're starting to see that, and we'll get long-winded into it, about when all the pandemic hit, and they were like the doctors were being attacked. It's like, you never would have thought that doctors would be attacked and military personnel for standing up. But all of a sudden, everybody was on the same level. And everybody was, almost like everyone became black all of a sudden, who weren't the people in power. So
Right.
I think this has made, opened a lot of eyes. And I credit social media, because if it didn't exist, we would never know half the things that have been happening in the world or in America itself.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, in fact, if you look at the percentages of those out protesting, it's incredible. It's everybody. Everybody is on the street right now. And you're right, that sense of vulnerability for folks that have typically never had to experience vulnerability is, I think you're right, a great kind of impetus. Ricardo, any final words on this, and then we can move?
Yeah, the one thing that, just from a selfish point of view, because like you said, when we started SOLCON, and, especially for me, my goal or dream was that it would also be a main catalyst in terms of building relationships and connections between the Black and brown communities, which were, I think in a long time, we've been kept apart by different institutional forces, and we haven't had a lot of information about each other's histories or situations in this country. So I'm glad that Juneteenth is finally coming to the fore, and that we're also getting a lot more information about the reality of Black experiences going on. But my hope too is that it works the other way too, and that African Americans can learn a lot more about what brown people have been going through and stuff like that. I know, people don't know a lot about the common histories that we share. People don't know that the majority of African slaves came through Mexico and South America, a lot more than ever came to North America. People don't know the first slave rebellions, Black slave rebellions, were in Mexico on this continent. A lot of people don't know about, the Caribbean. A lot of people don't know that Mr. Schomburg, was a Black Puerto Rican. So there's a lot of information that could go both ways that can really help us unite,
Absolutely.
artistically and culturally and also politically. So I'm hoping this moment can serve, to help us in that way as well.
Yeah, our shared histories of lynching, right? Being lynched. Oh my gosh, there's so much horror, unfortunately, that brings that kind of common ground that we're pushing against. It continues today. The violence, the culture side, right? The erasure, the violent erasure of our cultural presence, all of our histories, our things that we create to share with others to make sure that we're seen, and our demand for reparations. And we're seeing this everywhere. I wanted to move us into some of the spaces that we've just talked about, the Latino Comics Expo that's been mentioned, SOLCON, now the Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival. And Stanford, you can talk a little bit about the importance of the renaming, the reshaping of that space. Corona Con, maybe Lisa, you can talk a little bit. These are decolonizing spaces of decolonization and then forceful re-inhabitation. Maybe we can start with you, Lisa.
It was just an idea I was playing around with when coronavirus start hitting. It's always, I think people of color always tend to adapt to what's going on. We're not mocking it or laughing at the seriousness of it, but we roll with the punches. We make things work for us because that's how we've been conditioned to turn a negative situation into a positive. So that's how I see that our space has always been violated. Even in the neighborhoods where I live right now, they're totally being changed. And it's with such a force that you turn around and there's hardly any African Americans left in the neighborhood. They're gone. I don't know where they go to, but they're no longer there. And it only takes like one person to start, you know, buying up property, and then they raise the taxes and make the houses so expensive that only wealthier people can buy them. And then the taxes go up, and then the other people in the neighborhood can't afford the taxes. So it's ongoing. This is actually a tragedy, because so many people have lost their homes and their neighborhoods and their communities because of this happening.
Ricardo, and then Stanford.
No, like I said, even with everything going on, you know, just seeing all these different cons of, it brings me hope, and it brings like a warmth to my heart. Like I said, you know, back in 2011, you know, we had support among the ground forces, like I say, but I can't tell you how many like potential sponsors or even professional people would say like, you know, why are you separating yourself? Just go to Comic-Con, you know, da 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 da. And it's like, I just feel so fortunate that, you know, a lot of these cons have provided a foundation, a place that, you know, like with everything going on, we have a place where artists and creators can get together, can exchange ideas, can create. And I'm just so thankful for that. And I you know, I salute you with all the work you've been doing, Professor. Like Stanford said, is creating that critical element, that, you know, commenting on our work. It's proven so important. And just like I said, the support from the Black and Brown, SOLCON, everybody. Like I said, you know, we don't always have to go and kiss, you know, corporate America's behind. We don't always have to go begging for a spot. The goal with our expo and all the other ones is like to have our own space, you know, to have our own thing. We're not constantly having to ask people permission. I think Duke Ellington, you know, said it best. Somebody asked him one time when he was at the end of his career, like, you know, why do you still keep going to the Apollo? Why do you still go to the Chitlin circuit? You know, you could be at Carnegie Hall all the time. And I think his quote was, you know what? Sometimes you just want to be around your own people and just swing. That's the way I look at our cons. It's like, it's just a perfect spot where we can just be ourselves and create and look to the future.
Beautiful. Stanford?
I mean, what I find really interesting about these, I call them these smaller cons that tend to focus on, you know, they're not meant to focus on the mainstream, right?
Oh, okay.
Is how it's not just the mergers, but it's also how they become these places where creators get together and redefine who we are, right? You know, like I recall going to one of the very early SOLCONs, and what I think was really interesting was, you know, SOLCON's been around since before BCAF, the Black and Brown Comic Arts Festival, which prior was just the Black Comic Arts Festival, right? But several people who eventually went to create BCAF were Black people who started to regularly attend SOLCON. And, you know, and through those interactions, people looking at their work and saying, you know, this is the work that's kin to my work, right? And having that kin being, expanding the we from being, you know, just us who have this narrow definition of Blackness to no, Black and Brown people have, you know, we have historical connections. We face some very similar systemic issues, and we face some of the same struggles being represented in comics. And so you know what happened is that BCAF gets started, and then it didn't take long for the people in BCAF to be like, wait a second, let's go, you know, let's not be narrow, right?
Yeah.
You know, BCAF has always been SOLCON from its inception was a very friendly place for brown and Black people. And BCAF since its inception was a friendly place for Black and brown people, but it took the next step, which was to say, you know what, we're not going to be just a friendly place. We're not going to be a friendly Black place for brown people. No, we're going to redefine people like us, we, to be Black and brown. And I feel that that's also happening at SOLCON. I mean, when when African American creators go to SOLCON, it's like in their mind they think of it as being spelled SOUL, and they go to be with their people, and going to be with their people are the Black and brown people at SOLCON. And I think that that's one of the things that's amazing about these types of conventions, because they're the nexus where people meet people who have similar struggles, similar desires, and then out of the redefinition of their lives, you see a redefinition of the cons.
Yeah, that's great. And also these great synergies, right? Where we've, it's not just, chit chat. We are transforming in and across and with together, right? Working, collaborating, all sorts of amazing things. Stanford, you are, you do so much to kind of decolonize and inhabit and transform. Maybe you can share just a couple of things. Your podcast, I know you're very active right now with the Black Lives Matter. And yeah, just a little kind of elevator moment of your work right now.
Well, I mean, when people ask me what I am, I have to say, honestly, I identify most as a former archaeologist who is an anthropologist who loves to create and explore the world through comics. The images you see are of me in my mask that I've been sporting. That was actually created by Tawana Jennings, John Jennings' wife. And what I look at comics as a way to explore, and I also make comics. So you see also one of my images with the mask at the center. I'm currently working on a comics and culture podcast with my partner Sienna Greaves. I created an alter ego many decades ago called Brother Story, and her alter ego is the correspondent. And what we're doing is we're seeing where the stories take us. But a lot of what we're doing is we're interviewing comic creators, but we're also thinking not just about how comic creators create culture, but also how culture creates comic creators. Lately, where I live, there's been a lot of protests, a lot of unrest, and I regularly go out on my bike and just document it. I take videos and pictures of the different protests. I'm documenting the looting. I'm documenting the cleanup. And I haven't figured out exactly how that's going to be incorporated into my artistic and my scholarly work, but that's kind of what I think of as the task, as what I'm here to do, which is to be Brother Story, to go out and look at the stories at the side of the road, in the big spaces and the small spaces, and to find ways to bring them to life.
Thank you, Stanford, for sharing that. Ricardo.
Yeah, I'm kind of, with my work with Latino Comics Expo, that's been really satisfying. We're gonna try to do something for our 9th year this year, and then next year will be our 10th anniversary, if you can believe it. The little expo that could, and that's brought a lot of satisfaction. Like I always tell people, the best thing about our expo is when you see, like, the older people will come to our expo and they'll have tears in their eyes. I'm talking like 40, 50-year-old guys will come up to us and say, I always dreamed that there'd be a convention like this. And then the other group that really loves us are the young kids that, will come to our convention. I'm talking about like the 7, 8-year-old kids that are like, wow, I've never seen an Aztec warrior before. Or, wow, I've never seen a Mayan princess before. And that makes me happy that our work, continues, because, when I was raising my kids, that was the main, issue when I went to Comic-Con with them. It's like, Daddy, we're the Latino comics, we're the Latina princesses. And, that was always frustrating for me. So I'm glad that we've been able to keep our expo going. Plus, I'm happy to announce that this year I'm trying to get the title of the oldest person to ever come out with a comic. I'm happy to announce that in association with Marcus Collar, I will be putting out my first comic called The Border Avenger, which, like a lot of artists, will be trying to tackle issues of what's going on at the border. which is, you know, a really, really sad and crazy place right now. You know, whoever would have thought that our country would once again put young children in cages. There's a lot of death, you know, on the border right now between, you know, Latin America and US. And my comic is hopefully going to help explain, you know, why is the situation like that? And what is the responsibility of the US, you know, especially with what's going on. So I'm going to keep fighting. I'm going to keep fighting. I'm going to keep supporting. My goal is to keep being involved in the PCAF as well, SOLCON. We're doing such important work that, you know, I just thank everybody on the panel and Professor Aldama for supporting.
Thank you, Ricardo. And Lisa, you're right there with the incredible stuff that's happening in Columbus. You yourself creating art that's waking other folks, but also just really just kind of asserting the fact of our own humanity. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on?
It's basically all the chaos that occurred with, there were rallies, and of course there were a lot of outsiders and people doing a lot of destruction, and places boarded up damage or boarded their buildings up for protection. And so the artists in our Columbus, Ohio community went out and painted the boards to bring a message and bring peace and a certain level of calm back into the area. And I think this is a good way for artists to be heard and seen and to have a political voice through art. And that's pretty much like sometimes what politics are, a heavy influence of art. But we were showing that we can get our message across in a different way. And I think it was successful. And I think we're going to continue to push from the artistic perspective to say that, I mean, I've done marches and some protests for the last couple of weeks, but I found my place doing the art. This is where I belong. So my goal is to continue to produce work, but also influence the next generation and push them out there and have them express themselves and be aware of what they can do in the art world that has just as much power as a march.
Yeah, in fact, it's sort of part of that move from moment to movement, because the art becomes the writing, it becomes the archive that allows us to join arms, not just today, but of course tomorrow. Gosh, you know, this gets back to, you know, everything that you three have been beautifully articulating. You know, gosh, you know, yeah, there have been Black and brown superheroes, and there have been some better than others. Our communities tend to make the ones that really resonate with complexity. But we also have to, as you all have been reminding us, remember that our everyday superheroes are the people, our community, our family members, our young women of color standing up to the forces of power, destructive forces of power. So yeah, I can only thank all of you so much for the time that you have shared with me here, and that, yeah, you guys are absolutely amazing.
Professor Aldama, I just want to throw out just to say, you're the closest that we have to a Latinx superhero. I mean, you put out a book every 3 to 4 months. You support conventions all over the country. You're always there for backup and support. Gracias from us. You really are a great role model and a great area of support for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Take care, you guys, and I will be in touch as soon as this is all edited and ready to go.
Okay, thanks a lot. And if you need anything else, give me a holler.
Okay, take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.